Okay, everyone, today we're going to be going over the first part of your final exam study sheet. This is on Blackboard, so you should be able to access it on Blackboard. I'm going to go through it with you over the next 2 days, that's today and Friday, and we will talk about what it says. We will do some practice problems. This is pretty much a comprehensive sheet of things that will be on your final exam. Make sure you know all these things. Also, please make sure that you turn in your extra credit book report to me by 10:30 in the morning on Friday. Okay, so if you recall, back at the beginning of the year when everything was still normal, we had our first exam on chapters 1, 2, and 3. And here are some things that we went over on that exam. First of all, we talked about the budget constraint. The equation for the budget constraint is B equals PA QA plus PB QB. This means that your budget should be equal to the price of good A times how many of good A you buy, plus the price of good B times how many of good B you buy. Let's do an example here. An undergraduate has a weekly budget of $20. The only two goods that the student consumes are coffee and beer. The price of coffee is $2, and the price of beer is also $2. So we want to write down the budget constraint. Put a question here. Let's graph the budget constraint. Draw the budget constraint, graph the budget constraint. That's what we're going to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is take this budget constraint equation and plug in what we know. So what do we know? We know that our budget is $20. We have $20 to spend. And that $20 should be equal to the total amount we spend on beer and the total amount we spend on coffee. Beer costs $2, so we can replace this price with $2. And coffee also costs $2. So our budget constraint is a function now of how much beer we decide to buy and how much coffee we decide to buy. So let's make a little chart here. Okay, I'm going to make this one beer. This one will be coffee. And we're just going to see combinations of these goods we can buy with our $20, given that they each cost $2. So I'll write that here, $2 for a beer and $2 for a coffee. And I always like to start with some zeros, because that way we can draw a line that intersects the axes. Karen, stop that. Excuse me. Okay, so let's assume we buy 0 beers. The student buys 0 beers. Well, how much money do we have left over if we buy 0 beers? We're still going to have $20 left over. So the amount of coffee we can buy is going to be $20 divided by the price of coffee, which is $2. So if we buy 0 beers, we can buy 10 coffees. Now what if we buy 0 coffees? We can buy 10 beers. This budget constraint is pretty easy to figure out because the prices of the goods are equal. Okay, what if we buy 1 beer? If we buy 1 beer, we've spent $2. We have $18 left over. $18 divided by $2 for a coffee. We can buy 9 coffees with that. Let's do a number in the middle here. Let's go for 5 beers. We buy 5 beers. That cost us $10. We have $10 left over. How many coffees can we buy? 5 coffees. Okay, so I'm going to draw this out. Actually, can I just draw? I can't. Why can't I do that? Okay, we'll draw it over here in bait. So I'm just going to draw our axes here. Oh no, my pen's not working. That's fine. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to just put beer on this y-axis and coffee on this x-axis. Okay, and then we're going to graph this out. So we've said here that if we buy 0 beers, we can afford 10 coffees. Little line there, little 10. That is a bundle we can afford. That is a point on our budget constraint line. Okay, we said that if we buy 1 beer, then we can buy 9 coffees. This point right here, 1 beer, 9 coffees, that's a point on our budget constraint. Okay, we buy 5 beers. We've got enough money left over for 5 coffees. I'm just graphing this chart that we made to show all possible combinations of beer and coffee we can afford. Okay, well, what if we buy 0 coffees? All our money goes towards beer, and we could buy 10 beers. There's a point there as well. Okay. There's our budget constraint line. Obviously, this point should be on the line. All right, so this is what it looks like. The budget constraint is downward sloping because we have a trade-off here. If we want to buy more beer, we have to consume less coffee, and vice versa. There are some assumptions of the budget constraint. We assume that we spend our whole budget, which makes math easier over here. So we assume that we don't have a third column here that counts money left in our pocket. We don't want any money left in our pocket. We want to spend our budget efficiently. We want to consume directly on this budget constraint line. And we also assume that beer and coffee are the only 2 goods for sale. So it's not like we're saving our money for a stone or something like that. And then we have the PPF. This is for producers. The PPF is very similar to the budget constraint, except that instead of showing bundles of goods that we can afford to buy, we're showing bundles of goods that we can afford to produce. So let's see what we can do here. This is a production possibilities frontier, a PPF for a question having to do with educational economics. You are a principal of an elementary school, and you can produce writing scores and math scores. And see that we have a similar shape to the budget constraint here, except it's not a straight line. The PPF is curved. The production possibilities frontier is curved. This is due to a pretty interesting feature of production, that oftentimes the outputs that a firm is producing require similar inputs. So for example, if you're the principal of this school and you hire a teacher, that teacher can be used to produce both writing scores and math scores, which is why we have this flatter part of the PPF up here. I just think that's an interesting feature of production. Now, similar to the budget constraint, we want to produce on the line here. If we are producing anywhere inside the PPF, that means that we have resources left over, we have teachers and books and time in the day that we are not using. And we don't want that time in the day, those teachers, those books, left in our pocket, so to speak, at the end of the day. Same with the budget constraint, we are unable to produce or consume outside the line. Any point outside the line is unattainable. Any point inside the line is inefficient. Now, if our budget increases, if suddenly instead of $20 we have $30 to spend, we are going to see this whole budget constraint line shift outward. The whole thing is going to shift outward. So now instead of 5 beers and 5 coffees, now we can afford 5 beers, and whatever the math would be there, let's do that math. So if our budget is now $30, let's write this out. Budget is $30, and beer still costs $2, and coffee still costs $2. And we've said in this example that we buy 5 beers. I want to know how many coffees I can afford now with our new budget. So 30 minus 10 equals $2 times coffee. So we can afford 10 coffees now. I didn't draw that line super well, obviously, but if our budget goes out to 30, we can afford then 5 beers and 10 coffees instead of 5 beers and 5 coffees. Same with the PPF. If our budget increases, or if we get extra resources, or if the price of both resources decreases, we're going to see a shift outward of the whole entire PPF. And remember as well that if the price of one good increases for our budget constraint, for example, if the price of coffee increases at this original budget constraint, we're going to see a movement inward like this. The slope of the budget constraint will change. Coffee is more expensive, so now we're able to buy, at maximum, fewer coffees than we were able to before. And remember that this intercept here will not change. This point will be the same, because even if the price of coffee goes up to $1 million a cup, if you don't buy any, it doesn't affect you. At this point, 10 and 0, you're buying 0 coffees. So it doesn't matter how much a coffee costs because you're not buying any. However, the second you buy even 1/1,000,000th of a coffee, you're off on this completely other new budget constraint with a new slope. Okay. We talked about opportunity cost. This is very important. This is a cost that economists take into account that accountants or financiers often do not. So in addition to the monetary cost of buying something, you also have the opportunity cost, what you gave up when you chose to buy that thing instead of something else. In our example with the beer and the coffee, beer costs $2 and coffee also costs $2. So if you choose to buy a beer, not only have you spent $2, you've also lost the opportunity to spend that $2 on a coffee instead. So the opportunity cost of buying 1 beer is 1 coffee. We talked about comparative advantage, that if we want to produce efficiently, then the person with the lowest opportunity cost should be producing the thing. If it takes both of us 8 hours to mow the lawn, but I'm unemployed and you have a job working with orphans, I should be the one who mows the lawn. If you mow the lawn, that's 8 hours of working with orphans that you are giving up. But if I mow the lawn, that's 8 hours of just sitting on the couch that I'm giving up. I have the lowest opportunity cost. Okay, we have 5 things that shift our demand curve. Demand curve is downward sloping. It is one of our MVPs in economics. Let me draw this out. One of our star players, the demand curve. So when we draw this out, we are going to have price always on the y-axis and quantity, in this case quantity demanded, on the x-axis. The demand curve is downward sloping because as price increases, we want to buy less of these things. In other words, price and the quantity we can buy are inversely related. There are 5 things that shift demand. A change in income. An increase in income will shift the demand curve outward. Increase in income shifts demand curve outward. Change in demographics. Oh, sorry. Same thing. A decrease in income will shift our demand curve inwards. Change in demographics. So, for example, suddenly aliens come to Earth and they love grapes. The grapes are these aliens' favorite things. All of a sudden, we're going to see this demand curve for grapes shift outward. Change in taste. Maybe aliens don't come to Earth, but all of a sudden, grapes get really popular. Same thing. We're going to see that demand curve for grapes shift outward. Change in the price of substitutes or complements. A substitute is a good that you could buy or use instead of another good. So instead of grape jelly, a substitute for grape jelly is orange marmalade, perhaps raspberry jelly. If the price of grape jelly goes up to $1 million overnight, we're probably going to see the demand curve for orange marmalade or raspberry jelly shift outward. Grape jelly has become too expensive, and so now instead of buying grape jelly, we will buy any substitute. Complements. A complement to grape jelly is something like peanut butter. If the price of grape jelly goes up to $1 million, we probably will see not only a decrease in the amount of grape jelly people are buying, but also a decrease in the amount of peanut butter they are buying, because these two things are often bought together. Changing future expectations. If we expect that the price of grape jelly will go up to $1 million within the next week, we will see the demand for grape jelly this week shift outward as people prepare for that increase in price and they buy up the grape jelly. Okay, and I'm going to add our second player here. Player 2, just as important to the story we're telling, the supply curve. Together, these two curves work together to illustrate the tension of humankind. All right, supply curves shift upward because as price of a good increases, suppliers want to sell more and more of that thing. So you can see the tension here. If it were up to consumers, if consumers were the only ones in existence in the market, we would want infinity things for $0. But if producers were in charge of the market, they would want to produce 0 things, right? They wouldn't want to work at all, and they would want the 0 things they're selling to cost $1 million. So we have to come to some kind of agreement here. We have to do a back and forth between suppliers and demanders, producers and consumers, and we will come to our equilibrium point here in the middle where supply and demand meet. And this is where we will find our equilibrium quantity. Don't forget that at equilibrium, quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. And this is also where we will find our equilibrium price. Okay. Okay, things that can shift supply. Input prices. If you produce grape jelly and the price of grapes or sugar goes up to $1 million, we're going to see an inward shift of the supply curve for grape jelly. The supply curve will shift inward like this, which will cause, if we draw this out, this is our new equilibrium here. We exist now on this supply curve, where the price of grapes is $1 million, so we are unable to make as much grape jelly. The quantity will decrease, and the price of grape jelly will increase at our new equilibrium here. Okay, natural conditions. There's a hurricane at the grape plantation. This is going to shift our supply curve backward. Conversely, if it's a great year for grapes, they're growing like crazy, they're huge and purple and we love them, then we're going to see the supply curve for grape jelly shift outward. Government policy is something that's going to affect our supply curve, and technology. If we come out with a grape picking machine that can replace our human workers, and it is the cotton gin of the grape jelly industry, we're going to see that supply curve for grape jelly shift outward. At equilibrium, here we have our Q star, and that is the point where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. When I'm talking about the supply curve and I'm talking about quantity, I'm talking about quantity supplied. When we're talking about the demand curve and we're talking about quantity, we're talking about quantity demanded. But in equilibrium, where we have reached our agreement between producers and consumers, quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. Everyone who has something to sell can sell it. Everyone who wants to buy something can buy it. At the end of the day, the shelves are empty and the pantries are full. Also at equilibrium, the marginal cost is going to be equal to marginal utility. Don't forget this. Let's write this out. Marginal cost, the additional cost of one additional unit. So what would the marginal cost be of a beer in the example we did before with the budget constraint? If you want to buy one more beer, that's going to cost you $2 more. So the marginal cost of a beer is $2. Now, what if you buy one more beer and that beer makes you 5 happier? Well, the marginal utility of that beer then is 5. So marginal utility is the additional utility, which we call, happiness, usefulness, desirability. That's a philosophical part of economics that we can get into anytime you want to come to my office hours. But economists call this utility, the additional utility of one additional unit, from one additional unit. So for consumers in equilibrium, we want this marginal cost, the additional cost, we want that to be equal to the additional utility that we get from consuming that item. Now for producers, we have the same thing, except instead of happiness or utility, producers operate in terms of revenue. So at equilibrium for producers, the additional cost of one additional unit should be equal to the marginal revenue, which is the additional revenue from one additional unit. So for producers in equilibrium, marginal cost equals marginal revenue. For consumers, marginal cost equals marginal utility. We talked about price floors and price ceilings, and again, all of this is in the slides that I've uploaded to Blackboard. Please go through those. This should also be in your notes from the beginning of the semester when we talked about this. We went over this really, really in depth. I'm not going to go over it in depth right now. We talked about a price floor, which is a mandated lowest allowed price that producers may charge for something. An example of this is the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a price floor. Firms are not allowed to pay any less than $7.25 or whatever it might be for an hour of your labor. We also have price ceilings. This is a cap on something. Rent control is an example of a price ceiling. You're not allowed to charge more than $1,002,000 for an apartment in New York City. And these things become an issue when we enact a price floor below the equilibrium price that producers and consumers have already decided by themselves. And a price ceiling is an issue when the ceiling is issued below the equilibrium price we have already decided on in the market. So far we've been talking about the market for goods and services. We've been talking about buying and selling grape jelly, buying and selling beer, coffee, dog walking services, lawn mowing services. Now we're going to be talking about what happens if we're buying and selling labor. In the labor market, firms are consumers and individuals and households are producers. You are a producer. You operate on the supply curve in the labor market. Firms operate on the demand curve in the labor market. The price of your labor is your wage. That's what we call that. So a little hint, if you see a supply and demand diagram, and instead of our friend price up here on the y-axis, you see a little W, that's a little hint that we're talking about the labor market. Okay. Things that shift the demand curve for labor, demand for output. If you work at the Silly Band factory and it's 2008 or whatever it might be, Silly Bands are taken off. Everyone loves them. Those little rubber bands, they look like regular rubber bands. You take one of them off your wrist out of the millions you have there, and oh my God, it's a hippopotamus. They're going through the roof. The Silly Band factory is now hiring workers left and right. The demand for workers at the Silly Band factory is a function of the demand for the Silly Bands themselves. Education and training. What if you have a master's degree? The demand for your labor will be higher. Technology. That's something that affects the demand curve for labor. If we have robots that can do your job twice as fast for a third of the price, I'm sorry, but the demand for your labor is going to shift inward. Number of companies in the market, government regulation, and the price and availability of other inputs. Can you get the kid down the street to do this for $5 under the table? Can you get a robot to do it? There's three things that shift the supply curve for labor. Number of workers available. If there's only one guy who can do the job, that supply curve looks very different than the regular one we're used to. Required education. If to work at the Silly Band factory, you have to have at least a master's degree. Fewer people are going to want to work at the Silly Band factory, and that supply curve will shift backward. We also have government policies. Those are generally something that affect the supply curve, so that'll be kind of an easy hack for you to help remember that. A second type of market we've been discussing that was on your second exam is the market for loanable funds, the market for money itself. In what situation would you pay more than $5 for a $5 bill? Maybe a situation in which you don't have $5 right now, but you need it. So you can ask your friend for $5 and say, when I get paid on Friday, I'll give you $6 if you give me $5 right now. The price of that $5 bill is the extra dollar you're going to have to pay your friend come payday. The price of that money is the interest rate. And another little hint here, if you see our best friend, the supply and demand diagram, and instead of price on the y-axis, there's a little I for interest rate. That's a hint that we are dealing with the market for financial capital. There's one thing that shifts the demand curve for financial capital, and this is future expectations. If we think there's going to be a run on the banks in 3 weeks, we are going to see the demand for loanable funds shift outward right now. Everyone wants to go and get their money out of the banks. Three things, I have two things here. Three things that shift the supply of financial capital. Now, in these examples, the people who demand financial capital are the borrowers, the people who go to the bank and get loans. And the people who supply financial capital are the people who have their money in savings at the banks, because the bank loans out money that people put into it in the form of savings. And it lends that money out to borrowers, demanders of financial capital. Three things that shift the supply curve for financial capital: changes in consumption levels. If you are buying things, you cannot save the money that you used to buy those things. So if we find that people are consuming more and more, we can assume that they're saving less and less, and there are fewer loanable funds to give out. A change in income. If income increases, and with some assumptions involved here, we can say if income increases but people are still saving 50% of their income, we're going to see an increase in savings, because 50% of $1 million is greater than 50% of $900. and change in the relative risks of an investment. We've been talking about, let me think about this. Instead of putting your money in the bank to earn interest, you could invest your money in a business and perhaps make more money back. If a really, really good investment comes your way that's very low risk, you will probably invest in that instead of putting your money in savings in the bank, which will decrease the supply of financial capital. Anything that keeps people from saving their money in a bank will shift the supply curve backward. Anything that encourages people to put their money in the bank shifts our supply curve outward. And anything that affects people wanting to borrow money from the bank will shift our demand curve. Okay. All right, we are going to stop there before we get into elasticity on Friday. Again, this is on Blackboard. You should go and look at it. I'm not going to go over part 3 very much because you just had an exam on that, but we will do externalities a little bit on Friday. So we will do elasticity. We will touch a little bit on the profit function, and then we will talk about externalities on Friday.